The critical and commercial success of Metroid Prime was well met with a surprise revival of a dormant series, now successfully in 3D, much like Mario and The Legend of Zelda had just done prior. As such, like many successful series, Nintendo requested Retro Studios to make a sequel. With that, Retro Studios started to prepare a number of pitches for review in making a game that would live up to the first game's legacy. Last time, we explored a rather thorough pitch that was being made right at the end of Metroid Prime 1's development, which involved killer AI aboard a massive ship the size of several Star Destroyers, bounty hunters that could be used in a co-op mode, and a very in-depth multiplayer mode, all to be made within only 1 year of development using the same engine. However, that was scrapped shortly after, and the team decided to now shift focus to something more familiar but capable of standing up to the last game's quality. That in addition to an over-the-top marketing in hopes of fighting tough competition in winter 2004. So today on Cut Content, we explore the history and beta unused content of Metroid Prime 2. Before we begin, please hit the subscribe button and hit the notification bell too to further support us and keep creating new videos. With the first major pitch now rejected, Retro Studios wished to go in a different direction. The idea was a story about the conflict between light and dark. A simple idea that previous Nintendo games have explored. But their intention was to make a story that everyone could understand. Light and dark. Possibly, this idea of making a simpler story may in fact be the very reason why the original pitch was rejected due to its complex story. As senior designer Mike Wicken put it, "We wanted a push and pull. The whole game is pushing and pulling you back and forth between the dark and light." It ended up being that we wanted something that could feed into that dichotomy, that conflict between the two, and how the player's basic abilities reflect that. In other words, even going beyond the story, the whole game was to have that feeling of contrast, whether it be your weapons, the enemies, and even the world. And as mentioned prior, this was familiar ground for Nintendo, as previous games such as The Legend of Zelda: A Link to the Past had done this. In fact, they even sought advice from an unnamed developer of A Link to the Past on incorporating the ideas into the game. As such, much like that game, the concept of a light and dark world that Samus would travel between became the focus of the game. In fact, unlike the first pitch, which had the idea of reusing features, models, and even the whole engine from the first game, this new approach virtually used nothing from the first game, a clean slate for what was to be the true follow-up to Metroid Prime. However, the only things they did want to return were ideas that were cut from the original game due to time constraints, such as the screw attack and kick jump ability. And to keep to the idea of light and dark, even the music was set to reflect that. With the return of Metroid musician Kenji Yamamoto, his focus was making both a regular theme that would reflect the areas of Light Aether and a dark variation for the same areas in Dark Aether. To top that off, the idea this time was to make a tougher game too, now that the audience was already used to the first game's controls and gameplay, adding in more unique boss fights to the point where, even in the final days of development, producer Kensuke Tanabe requested for 2 of the bosses to have an uptick in difficulty. However, even though that first pitch was scrapped, several ideas were still kept for the final game, with many being a natural fit to the theme of light and dark. Starting off and going in order, in the original pitch, you had hostile aliens that were suspended in animation, which now it was reinterpreted into the friendly Luminoth, who were also in stasis. The original pitch also mentioned traveling to another dimension where the physics and world were different. This idea could have stemmed into the idea of traveling between the light and the dark world. Now, when it comes to enemies, a few did survive into Metroid Prime 2's story. Normally in Metroid Prime, you never see many androids or robots that Samus has to tackle, and almost everything is organic. The original pitch was the first to make common enemies of an army of droids, and just so it happens, it even made it into the final game with the Sanctuary Fortress area, where Samus faces a numerous amount of them. In the original pitch, the AI was making organic creatures by merging different species together. One of them was the Shock Beast, which was 1/2 space pirate and 1/2 something else. However, despite the pitch being scrapped, the exact design was kept for the final game and was used as the design for the Space Pirate Trooper. though it seems that the weakness which was its exposed heart was now removed. But the biggest inspiration from the original pitch was the idea of an evil Samus that became Dark Samus in the final game. Now it's pretty clear from the ending of Metroid Prime 1 that they wanted some evil humanoid to fight Samus in a sequel. In fact, it was the developer's desire to have Samus fight a boss that was more her size in contrast to Metroid Prime 1's bosses, which were all huge. The inspiration for that idea came from Samus fighting SAX in Metroid Fusion, and they wanted as such their own version for this game. With the theme of light and dark now being the main approach, Dark Samus fit more than ever into the idea, and thus became the central figure of this new story. Now, the design of Dark Samus changed numerous times during development, the two earliest being these two pieces of concept art, with this one being theorized to be the design that was to be used with this original pitch. Both look very different from the final Samus, the original pitch version being more in line with the design of the aliens on the ship, while also looking like a large amalgamation of other features. If this was indeed for the first pitch, it might reflect how it was made from copying abilities from Samus and also the other bounty hunters, leading to this warped design. Now, as for the other design, this one has a more sleek and more organic look, as well as looking a bit more simple at that. In many ways, looking more like a humanoid shadow of Samus. But eventually, they moved past this idea and came to a more familiar but different territory. This one looking more like the Dark Samus we know, with a body that looks more like armor than flesh, though still with many differences, such as being jet black here and having a T-visor helmet. However, the obvious difference here is that Dark Samus looked as if it could phase out or phase in from a mass of bubbles. While we have seen the final Dark Samus zip across areas or even fade into a particle of phase-on, maybe it originally would phase across as a mass of phase-on bubbles and also fade into bubbles upon defeat. Now, the interesting part about this design is that it went as far as getting a model. It has slight differences, such as the visor being a straight T-shape, but otherwise is literally Samus' suit but colored black. The odd part is how, unlike the normal Dark Samus, who is very aggressive in all her actions, this Dark Samus is much more stealthy. With the inspiration from SAX, it is possible that at some point Samus was required to hide from it, and Dark Samus would slowly go around looking for her, much like SAX did in Fusion. Now, while this design looked to have evolved into the final Dark Samus we know, there was another that was of a similar design but a bit more organic as seen with this, and how it has flesh that stretches across. The more obvious points being its shoulder pads, looking a lot like the membranes of a Metroid, which is fitting as Dark Samus was made from Metroid Prime's remains. In fact, this might even be inspired from another concept in the original pitch that had an organic enemy that was half human and half Metroid called the Humatroid, that had a Metroid right on its chest. And Dark Samus being both of a Metroid DNA and Samus's DNA would make it in reality a sort of a Humatroid like this too. And then there is this one additional art featuring an armored Dark Samus, which is somewhat a cross between Dark Samus and the top of a space pirate. Makes one wonder if they had the idea of Dark Samus even being affiliated with the space pirates at one point. And the other aspect they wished to bring was multiplayer to the game, which was sort of a carryover from the original pitch. While the original pitch had a very in-depth multiplayer mode with many modes and even online play, this had two very basic modes and was offline only. They were fun, believe me. I actually played this mode with the only other person at the time that I knew who played this game, but the priority was clearly single player mode this time, and on a much more heavier scale at that compared to the original pitch. Thus, multiplayer's grand features from the pitch just couldn't make it in. Now, aside from the carried over concepts, there were a number of cut features, including existing enemies found via concept art and data mining the game. To begin, we have a couple of cut enemies, including the Ice Mites. Given their appearance, they were likely to be the creepy crawlers in an ice region of the game, but since the game lacked an ice region, they were cut early. Next is this cut humanoid looking enemy, looking like a close range fighter, almost assassin like in fact. The word Chozo does also appear on it, making one wonders if it has any ties to the Chozos here, or maybe it is in some ways a Chozo itself. Now, some enemy properties were changed or even went unused actually. The first of which is the enemy air thorns, which are these flying droids that you can only ever see while going through a morphball tunnel, and therefore you cannot scan them. However, through a glitch that lets you clip out of the normal playable map, you can walk to that morphball tunnel and actually be able to scan the air thorns. And yes, they actually have a proper real scan that went unused as such. Going from one droid to another, we have the lost ability of the Resbit enemy. Normally, this enemy has a unique attack that would infect Samus's power suit with a temporary virus that shuts down her whole suit and reboots it for a few seconds, leaving Samus vulnerable. However, unused text exists listing something called the Resbit weapon virus, which would only disable Samus's weapon, and thus would be a lesser virus compared to the full system shutdown of the other one. Next up is the LightBringers, a simple crawler enemy that lights up the path and disappears upon getting the space jump ability. Normally, they are unkillable. However, if you skip getting the space jump through glitches and return to the LightBringers once you have all the beams, there are a number of unused behaviors you can witness. The Dark Beam will entangle and weaken them, while the Light Beam powers them up, and the Annihilator Beam outright destroys them, a feature that went unused. Now the big one is for the main antagonist of the game, Emperor Ing himself. Normally in his concept art, you can see that he has these glowy parts on his legs that may or may not be eyes for added creepiness, but in the game, he doesn't have anything like that. However, it seems that at one point he indeed was going to have these glowy parts there, and this is because the damage collision is still there where it normally should be. If one uses the screw attack and hits where the glowy parts were going to be, it damages the boss. In other words, the boss fight was going to be more complex with the utilization of his leg weakness. Potentially you had to hit all these spots before the main weak spot appears. In fact, his scan data confirms this by stating it is now capable of shielding its vulnerable areas with energy barriers. Beams of opposite polarity can damage these barriers, however. Heavy damage to these barriers will cause them to drop, exposing the creature's weak spots. Target the weak spots to immobilize and damage the enemy. However, this fight is very different from the description. There are no barriers that protect these weak spots, and no weak spots to shoot at in order to immobilize the Emperor before hitting his main weak spot. Now, if we look at the concept art once more, the Emperor is absolutely massive next to Samus, much more so compared to the final game. So the intended design may have been a much larger Emperor, and thus the requirement may have been to knock down its legs in order to bring its head down to the floor, where Samus can't shoot him then. In addition to these, there's also text for unused enemies too. Some left over from Metroid Prime 1, such as the Chozo, Ghost, Glider, Reaper Vine, and Zoomer, but also some that were legitimately made for this game but cut. These include a set of dark enemies, including the Dark Pirate Arrow Trooper, Dark Shriek Bat, Dark Sporb, and Dark Triclops, which a normal Triclops enemy was also planned too, but cut ultimately. Next, the Chika 3, which would have been the third form of the Chika villains. Next are the Creatures of Light, including Kenobites, which may have been the organic version of the mechanical Mechanobite. Mini-Rees, also known as the Infant Shriek Bats. And Flogus, which would have been the normal version of the final game's Dark Flogus. Now, moving from enemies to the weapons that kill enemies, there are a series of cut weapons actually found via data mining the game. The first three being 3 cut bombs: the Annihilator Bomb, Dark Bomb, and Light Bomb. Thankfully, text exists for these abilities. The Light Bomb would create a trap that would explode upon an enemy entering its detection radius, burning the enemy while also blinding and stunning dark creatures. The Dark Bomb would release tendrils that would entangle and hinder enemies, and the Annihilator Bomb would release a cloud of light and dark particles that would seek and hurt all enemies within its radius. Honestly, very impressive moves, but in the end, kinda pointless with how overkill they already were with the impressive list of weapons we already had. Now, the next three are Charge Beam combos. These are Dark Shredder, Light Blast, and Imploder. While one might assume that these are charge combos in addition to the Dark Burst, Light Burst, and Sonic Boom, they are simply just old names for them, as I'll explain why in a bit. As well, the multiplayer mode had 3 attacks that were removed, but found via data mining the text. These include Absorb Attack, potentially a move that would siphon life, and a dark and light shield, which may have protected one against the opposing beam. And in addition to Samus's beta weapons, there is also Samus's beta light suit. Normally, it has a very sleek and slim look to it, but originally it was a rather bulky piece of armor that they were planning. It's even possible that this was actually an upgrade intended for the light suit. Now, during the development of the game, Nintendo offered people who registered enough games to their predecessor to Club Nintendo a Metroid Prime 2 demo disc, one that I personally own through just that. It utilized 12 rooms from the game's early sections but mashed them up together and cut them down to tell the opening of the game, including from when Samus arrives to when defeating the Warring Ing in Dark Aether and then stepping into the light portal where the game ends. Being a version before launch, it is officially a prototype of the game, therefore some neat beta content was found on it. One of which is a rather odd boost ball attack, which when Samus does lock onto the enemy, she flies right into them with a boost ball charge. Kinda like the way Sonic does it in 3D Sonic games actually. And remember those enemies I mentioned earlier that were found via leftover text? Well, a few more are actually found here, including the Ing Killer, which was a droid unit that would have protected the Luminoth fortress from Ing, but now seeks to kill all living beings that come near it. As well, another of the Chaika family is found, called the Chaika Swimmer. Might in fact have just been the more finalized name for the Chaika 3 that was mentioned earlier. And remember when I mentioned how the Dark Shredder, Light Blast, and Imploder are just beta names for the final charge beam combos? Well, this demo disc actually has a proper description for the Imploder ability, reading, "The Imploder is the Annihilator charge combo. It sends a blast of entangled dark matter, which then implodes in a burst of white-hot light." While it does confirm it to be the official charge combo for the Annihilator beam, its effect is different from the final games, which creates an effect similar to a shattered pane of glass. Now moving back to the main release disc of the game, there is one cut location found through data mining the text, called the Metroid Hive. This is the name of the location of the Metroid Queen from Metroid 2. In this case, it is possible that there were plans to have a larger presence of Metroids in the sequel, even featuring a Metroid Queen in some ways. Now the most impressive find comes in the form of concept art, depicting a rather different ending to Metroid Prime 2. Normally, the final boss is a very phasoned up Dark Samus, so high on phazon that you see its real body that resembles the now revived Metroid Prime under its armor, all while fighting it under a time limit before Dark Aether is destroyed. When defeated, it fades away in a mass of phazon particles. Samus escapes and everything is fine. The end. Well, this was definitely very different from the concept. Originally, they were going to go colossal, like with many final bosses, by having Dark Samus construct a large battle armor, potentially made from phazon and the energy from the collapsing Dark Aether, in order to fight Samus, even having the power to rip the ground and pull lava up. With Samus being as tiny as she is next to it, I wouldn't be surprised if one was to use the ground platforms on the lava to scale up to get to the colossal Dark Samus and hit the actual Dark Samus in what appears to be its weakness, as there is no armor covering her actually. However, it appears a bad ending was even planned that might even tie into this boss fight. It all stems from this one piece of concept art that showcases a Dark Samus wearing a version of the light suit and escaping an exploding Aether using all the phazon it has collected. The big question being, why does Dark Samus have the light suit? I mean, yeah, it can wear it cause it isn't actually a being of dark like the rest of Dark Aether are. Now, the obvious theory is that, much like Metroid Prime absorbing the Phazon suit in Metroid Prime 1 and becoming Dark Samus would do it again to a dying Samus, and thus now having a suit of light with strong Phazon capabilities. At the same time, we are seeing the regular Aether also blowing up here, which may also indicate that Dark Samus would have absorbed the energy from not just Dark Aether, but also of regular Aether too, and thus dooming both planets as it flies away. Honestly, what an amazing bad ending would have been too, if we had gotten it, that is. While all of that had been planned as development went on, the game had a deadline of holiday of 2004, and 3 months before the deadline, only 30% of the game was completed. As such, some of which was mentioned earlier may have been cut just to meet this deadline. including yet another attempt at bringing a playable port of Super Metroid to be unlocked, but couldn't due to the deadline. Being close to launch, the game also was in a dangerous spot as it was being alongside another major shooter, Halo 2. The Halo series at this point had taken over the market as the go-to shooter on console. Metroid looked very niche next to it as all eyes were focused on Halo 2, which happened to be releasing prior to the game. At the same time, the next Grand Theft Auto game, San Andreas, was set to release in November of 2004, leading to very stiff competition for Metroid Prime 2. Being that Metroid Prime 2 by the casual eye would be more comparable to Halo, it may be plausible to think that the marketing team decided to focus on Halo 2 only in capturing its audience, and it becomes obvious with their next move. At this point, a website was launched for Halo 2 in July of 2004 called I Love Bees. It was an alternate reality game that was in actuality a disguised viral marketing campaign to generate hype for Halo 2. It was first discovered via a hidden message in the Halo 2 trailer. This marketing proved very successful too, with how huge the viewership of the website was. To combat this, the marketing team of Metroid Prime 2 decided to do a similar approach as their competition, a disguised viral website to generate buzz for the game. They launched not just one, but 4 websites. The first was one called Channel 51, which spoke of conspiracy theories and the extraterrestrial. This site was supposedly operated by someone named Samantha Manis. Even back then as a teenager, I realized right away how this was just an anagram for Samus. This site contained screenshots and videos from the game, but claimed that they were real footage of aliens. Next is the Athena Astronautics, which claimed to be an organization for space exploration and colonization. Unfortunately, we can't access the site anymore due to the lack of flash needed for it. But we have a screenshot of the homepage, which has a rather Metroid Prime-like menu design. The site also contained a blog written by someone called Mackenzie King, making several references to Samantha Manis of Channel 51. Then we got Orbis Labs, which claimed to be a company developing a sort of battle sphere, describing it as a self-contained armored machine, which was obviously a reference to the Morph Ball. Neat part is that they supposedly had a prototype design of it here too. And lastly is the Luminoth Temple form, which by the name alone is obviously referring to the Luminoth Temple of the game. It only allowed those who were 17 and over to join, and had over 2,000 users. It also required a login to use the forms, but to get the login required one to look at the so-called Samantha Manis' last post for clues, a fake job posting on Monster.com with said clues, and also simply given to those who registered Metroid Prime 2 on the Nintendo website. Afterwards, when logging in, it would reveal itself as a Nintendo website where one would get new information for games including Geist, Killer 7, and new Metroid games. Then after, it asked you to make a username, and then you were able to explore the forums and talk with others. While this was all inspired by Halo 2's marketing in order to fight Halo 2 itself, they also had a crazy amount of other websites that were similarly named to Halo 2's I Love Bees website, with each site having a picture of Samus and a caption reading, "All your bees are belong to us. Never send a man to do a woman's job." Obviously a combination of an old famous meme, plus Halo 2's I Love Bees site, and at the same time taking a jab at Master Chief in comparison to Samus. Of course, the media quickly took notice of this campaign, and thus it had done its job to an extent with how widespread this was going. With viral marketing and being a true sequel that was being made on par with the original game's success, Metroid Prime 2 was released on November 15, 2004. Did the viral marketing work? Unfortunately, it didn't. Metroid Prime 2 was utterly crushed. In November 2002, the original Metroid Prime had done well enough to land in second place, just after Grand Theft Auto Vice City, while Metroid Prime 2 was all the way in 9th place in November of 2004, far behind Halo 2 and Grand Theft Auto San Andreas, and only a touch north of Dragon Ball Z Budokai 3. So what happened? Was the game just not as good as the first one? Well, no, as it was a critical hit once more, with scores of 9s and 10s across the board, and with the complaints mainly just being about the difficulty, while praising the story, environments, and length of the game. What had happened was obviously that it released at that unfortunate time with 2 mega hitters, and no matter how creative the marketing team got, and how much buzz they generated, they just couldn't compete. This combined with the GameCube at that point especially losing steam and even starting to fall behind the newbie Xbox in the market. Thus, it was released on what was a console that was starting to die out. While the game didn't meet commercial success, it was a critical success and truly held its own as not just being another failed sequel to a massively popular original game like so many others have prior. And with Nintendo's next console, the Wii, just being around the corner and expected to sell very high numbers, Metroid Prime 2's sales and success was good enough for Nintendo to greenlight making a third and final game in this trilogy, Metroid Prime 3, a game that I plan to cover soon, so hit the subscribe button, for I plan to be back with more Metroid and other games cut content soon. Hit the like button and comment below on what you would have wanted to be kept in Metroid Prime 2. So everyone, thank you for watching.